In today's lecture, we're going to be talking about the development of magnetic tape and magnetic tape machines. But first, we're going to talk about a piece that sort of predates the proliferation of magnetic tape recorders. It's a piece by a composer named Halim El-Dabh, and we're going to refer to the title of this piece as The Expression of the Tsar, although you might also see it online as Wire Recorder Piece. Halim El-Dabh is an Egyptian composer, and he created this piece while he was working at Radio Cairo. So kind of like John Cage, working at this radio station gave Halim El-Dabh access to technology and recording equipment that he wouldn't necessarily have access to otherwise. And in this case, he had access to a wire recorder. So we'll talk about magnetic tape machines in a little bit, and wire recorders work really similarly, except instead of tape or paper with rust on it, it uses a magnetic metal ribbon that goes through the system on different reels. So you can imagine it's kind of a cumbersome way to record. The sound quality was pretty poor compared to tape, and also it was kind of dangerous to use. Imagine if the ribbon broke and the reel was still going, it might accidentally slice someone's arm open, or it could be a little bit dangerous. So the wire recorder wasn't used for very long, but it did sort of predate the kind of interface and mechanisms of magnetic tape. So in some ways it's pretty similar. So for this piece, The Expression of the Tsar, Halim El-Dabh recorded a Tsar ceremony. And a Tsar ceremony is a kind of ritual, typically kind of an exorcism that is seen throughout the Horn of Africa or in different North African countries. And it involves lots of different things, including chanting, dancing, music. It's a real sort of ecstatic ceremony that could go on for hours and hours and hours. And Halim El-Dabh was interested in sort of the sound world of this ceremony, and so he went and recorded the ceremony. And because he had access to other equipment, so he had the wire recorder, which he used to record the ceremony, but then he also, once he was done with the recording, was able to further alter the recording using tools that he had at the radio station. And one that was really cool and really unique at the time was what they called a reverb room. And it was basically a room that had movable walls, so you could change the reverb of the recording by playing the recording back into the room with the walls at differing points to create kind of echo effects and make it sound like it was played in a different room. So what he basically did by using this room and other techniques is he removed the fundamental of the recording. And remember when we went back all the way to lecture 1, when we talked about the kind of basics of sound and how sound works, the pitch that we tend to hear when we hear any sound, or say a note played by a saxophone, is the sound's fundamental. And that's the frequency that resonates the loudest. And it tends to be like the inherent sort of frequency or quality of a given instrument or a given thing. So a percussion instrument can also do the same thing. So what Halim El-Dabh does is he removes the fundamentals that are in this recording. And so you kind of get the impression that you're hearing voices, but it sounds like some of the thrust or the body is removed from them. And he did that intentionally. And he has this quote here where he talks about sort of what he did and why he did it. And he said, "I just started playing around with the equipment at the station, including reverberation, echo chambers, voltage controls, and a re-recording room that had movable walls to create different amounts of reverb. I concentrated on those high tones that reverberated and had different beats and clashes, and started eliminating the fundamental tones, isolating the high overtones so that in the finished recording the voices are not really recognized anymore, only the high overtones with their beats and clashes may be heard." And he felt that by doing so, he kind of got the inner expression or the inner voice of the, or inner character of the Tsar ceremony. So I'm going to play a little bit here, and I know that when I tend to play videos on these lecture videos, the sound quality isn't great, so make sure that you go back and listen to it on your own. So that's just a little bit. Hopefully you hear the sense that it sounds kind of like voices, but again, without the fundamental tones taken out. So you're only hearing the overtones there. And Halim El-Dabh had a really long career working with electronic music. Shortly after this piece was made in the 1960s, I believe, he immigrated to the United States and worked at the Columbia Princeton Electronic Music Studio, which we'll talk about next week. And he made lots of different pieces there and worked presented concerts and worked with students there. So he had a really long career making electronic music. Okay, so now we're going to talk a bit about tape machines. And I want to just preface this by saying these tools are often referred to as tape recorders, but I tend to call them tape machines because they were the first kind of thing to use magnetic tape that could both record and play back sound. So the fact that it could play back sound is also really important. So the background of tape machines is that they were developed in Germany really around the 1920s, but they had really, really poor sound quality. So at the time, phonograph records and gramophones, those were still a much better way to actually record sound. So they weren't used very often. And radio was becoming really popular. And so radio was the best way to sort of transmit recordings or music at the time. And in 1935, this same technology, which at the time was referred to as the magnetophone because it used magnetic energy and magnetic tape, was put on display at a fair in Germany, in Berlin. And so that was the first time that it was really introduced to the public. But again, the sound quality was really poor. So it didn't really take off, and it wasn't really practical for people to use yet. But then in World War II, that's when we really start to see the technology really take off. And before I get too far into that, I'm going to jump forward a little bit to talk just quickly about how magnetic tape machines work. So again, another way that these technologies tend to be referred to are reel-to-reel tape machines or reel-to-reel tape recorders. So these are all names to refer to the same technology. And again, these can both record and play back sound. And what they do is, it starts with a microphone or a sound source, and that turns acoustic energy into electrical energy here, and those signals are then amplified so that they're easier to pick up. And then when it goes through the magnetic tape machine, it's converted into magnetic energy, and then it is then kind of imprinted onto magnetic tape. So I'll get a little bit further into that. So you have an initial tape, and that's not always empty. Say there's an old tape that you don't really care about what's on it anymore. First, it goes through a magnet that erases whatever's on it. So there is ferric oxide on the magnetic tape, on the tape, which is early on was just a strip of paper, but then was something more like Scotch tape. And so ferric oxide is basically rust, so magnetic particles. And what happens is when it's recorded, those particles are arranged in different polarities. And by putting it over or under the erase head, that randomizes the particles, so they're no longer ordered. And then next it goes under another magnetic head that is the record head. So this is where it then reorganizes the particles into specific polarities that captures the sound, imprints the sound. And then the final magnetic head that it goes through is the playback. And so that picks up the polarity that's on here and converts basically magnetic energy back to electrical energy back to acoustic energy here. So if that doesn't make any sense to you, don't worry about it. Lecture 6 is going to be a demonstration of a magnetic tape machine with Scott Maxson, who runs the electronic music studio at UCSC. And so hopefully that demonstration will introduce this again from a different person's perspective and kind of reinforce what I just said. So don't worry too much if it doesn't make sense yet. Okay, so going back to sort of the timeline and the development of magnetic tape machines is that, again, they were sort of developed in the 1930s, 20s and 30s, but had pretty poor sound quality. There was a lot of noise in the signal. And it wasn't until World War II with really the Nazi Party who wanted to develop the tape technology so that it could be used for war. And the way that it came to, and another thing that they developed, which ended up being extremely important to making the sound quality better, is something called AC biasing. And so I'm going to go to another slide here. Basically what that is, here's sort of the erase head, record head, playback head. What AC biasing does is it introduces a really, really high frequency tone into the signal. And what that basically does is it cancels out the noise. And it's some trick of sound physics, but basically by introducing this signal, again, it really cancels out a lot of the noise. So what you really hear is then what's recorded. So that made the sound quality a lot better. So how did this magnetic tape machine, which was a German/Nazi development, come to the United States? Well, in World War II, there was a CIA agent in Germany named Jack Mullen. And one of the things that Jack Mullen did a lot was listen to the radio. The radio was a huge technology, really important during World War II. It was how basically most armies communicated. It was also really important for espionage and figuring out where the other governments were and what they were talking about, what they were doing. So Jack Mullen was listening to the radio, doing his espionage basically, and he heard what he thought was a live orchestra playing classical music. But he thought to himself, that's impossible. There's no way that there could be a live orchestra playing over the radio right now because we're in the middle of war. And so he knew to himself, the Germans must have been developing some new recording technology that we don't know about yet. So then it kind of became his personal mission after the war ended in 1945 to figure out what this new technology was and basically to take it, get access to it, and bring it to the United States. And that's exactly what he did. So once he found magnetic tape recorders, he brought them back to the United States, and then very, very quickly they were patented in the United States and made available for US companies to manufacture and sell. So what we see is by really 1947, 1948, the first magnetic tape machines become available in the United States. And again, kind of like with gramophones and phonographs, they were originally marketed as almost like an office tool, something that someone could do dictations in, a tool for secretaries, things like that. But then pretty quickly they became used for music. And there's an interesting history here, which is that Bing Crosby, who was kind of a famous crooner in the 1940s and 1950s, you might know him, he sung the song White Christmas. He basically became an early investor. And the reason why he became an early investor is that he was doing weekly radio shows, and he had to go into the radio station every week with his whole crew and do this radio show live. And he had to do it every single week. And so he thought, wow, if I could record and get really good sound quality, then basically I could record multiple shows at once and maybe come into the studio once a month. So he saw this as a huge kind of time-saving technology. And he not only invested in this technology, but you can see here he was also kind of featured in their advertisements. He was sort of a magnetic tape machine influencer, if you will. And because of his investment, it not only kind of helped this technology get off the ground, but it ended up eventually making it more affordable and basically proliferate everything. So it was used for radio, this was kind of the primary recording technology up through the 1980s and really even into the 1990s. So this was a really important technology. And it was also really important to electronic music. Again, it sort of defined electronic music up through the 1980s and even into the 1990s, where someone going through university in the 1990s might still learn how to use a magnetic tape machine. Here we have Bing Crosby. Our video is blocked, but you can look it up on your own. And again, just for context, Bing Crosby was so famous, he would have been like someone like Justin Timberlake or John Legend, who was kind of a, likable, generic pop singer who, would kind of was a sort of well-rounded personality where he kind of did variety shows and things like that. He could sing, he could dance, he could act, and that was the kind of stuff that was featured on his show. So that's it for this first video, first part of lecture 4. In the next part, we're going to look at 2 pieces that used magnetic tape really early on. All right, so we just learned about the early development of magnetic tape machines, and now we're going to talk about 2 early pieces that used magnetic tape technology. So first we're going to talk about a couple named Louis and Bibi Baron. Louis and Bibi Baron met in San Francisco in the mid-1940s. They were both really creative people, both musicians, both artists. Bibi Baron trained as a classical pianist, and Louis was also very musical, very creative. And they were sort of your kind of typical beatnik couple in the 1940s. And they decided in 1947 that they were going to get married and move to Manhattan, move to New York City. And along the way, so they got married along the way in Minnesota, where I believe Bibi was from. And as a wedding present, they had a family member who worked for 3M. And I'm going to go back 2 slides. So 3M, Minnesota Mining and Manufacturing, was one of the early companies that developed magnetic tape machines. And as a wedding present, a family member gave Louis and Bibi Baron a magnetic tape machine. What a wedding present. And so they took this with them to New York City, and basically once they were there, they decided that with this tape machine and other tools that they kind of gathered along the way, they were going to open a recording studio in Greenwich Village. And this recording studio in Greenwich Village really became kind of the center of creative activity in their neighborhood for a number of years in the 1950s. Poets, writers, composers, musicians would all come over. They would do things like poetry readings and concerts, and then they would also, of course, record people in their studio. And they were involved with several projects with this studio. One which was their own project was called The Sound Portraits, and that was basically like an early version of audiobooks where they would get their poet friends to read their own poems onto and record them onto records. So they recorded people like Tennessee Williams and Anais Nin and Henry Miller, and then they would record them reading their own work and then put it on record. And one thing that's kind of notable about these records is that they were bright pink, so they really, really stood out. And that also kind of indicates that they're sort of a bit eccentric, so a little bit left of center. Another thing that they did, which we'll talk about when we talk about the next piece, is the Music for Magnetic Tape project. And then the other activity that they did in the 1950s was they created music for film, mostly experimental films. And 2 that are the most notable are called The Bells of Atlantis and Jazz of Lights, which were by an experimental filmmaker named Ian Hugo, who was at the time married to Anais Nin. And so you can see there was this kind of creative circle that they kind of supported with their recording studio. And if you ever have a chance to see either of these films, they're both really gorgeous, interesting films, so I highly recommend that you see them. So it was really with a film soundtrack that they had their kind of biggest break. And that was with the soundtrack for the movie called Forbidden Planet from 1956. And this film was sort of important in a few ways. If you watch it now, and I highly recommend that you look up some scenes on YouTube, it's really slow and it's not that interesting, but at the time it sort of was groundbreaking in the sci-fi genre, both for its sound effects and for its visual effects. And it also kind of created a lot of norms in science fiction around certain kinds of sounds that might be paired with certain kind of visuals. For instance, something like tape delay with a flying saucer, which you'll hopefully see later. So a little bit more about the film. It's kind of a pretty typical sci-fi space adventure film. A crew is out in space in the future, and they discover on their radar a planet that they've never seen before, and they decide to go and investigate. And then from there, it's more of a kind of generic love story between one of the space adventurers and a woman who happens to live there. But there are some side plots that make it really interesting. For instance, there's an ancient alien race that lived on the planet but had since been destroyed, and they created a lot of technology that then the people that lived there adapted. So that's kind of a tangent. But another interesting thing about the film is that the plot was kind of loosely based on Shakespeare's Tempest, plus a lot of Freudian analysis. So in some ways it was kind of really emblematic of its time. So Louis and Bibi Baron were first hired to make some sound effects for the film and what's called incidental music. And incidental music is maybe just like something that would happen like in between scenes or something like that, but not the full soundtrack. And the executives that were producing the movie liked what they were doing so much that they actually ended up having them do the entire film soundtrack and all the sound effects. And they developed some really interesting techniques, which we'll talk about more later. So the reason why we're talking about Forbidden Planet and Louis and Bibi Baron's soundtrack for the film is that it was the first film soundtrack made up entirely of electronic sounds. And that was really groundbreaking in a lot of ways, but also they faced a lot of pushback for this move. Basically, movie executives were so uneasy with the fact that a movie soundtrack or a movie score could be entirely electronic. Basically, from this point, they were used to just orchestras using written music notation to make the film score, that they insisted that the soundtrack not be called a score, that it be called electronic tonalities, which is kind of a cool thing to call a film soundtrack. But what it did was it made it so that Louis and Bibi Baron were basically ineligible to receive any awards. They couldn't be nominated for an Oscar. They couldn't be nominated for any of the big awards for their work. And in some ways, it sort of discounted their really important contribution. To get into the details of the music that Louis and Bibi Baron made in general, and also in particular for the Forbidden soundtrack, was based on a really unique working method. So they had this kind of interesting division of labor. Louis created these electronic sound generating circuits, and you can see he's holding one here in this picture. And Bibi was basically the recording engineer. She recorded those sound generating circuits to tape, and then she edited and altered the tape. So this was a real kind of division of labor between them. And these circuits were really unique. And something else to mention before I get into this is that Louis and Bibi were making this kind of music really early on, before there were any kind of standard tools or techniques. So it's not like Bibi had a handbook on how to make music with magnetic tape machines or experimental tape techniques. And Louis didn't necessarily have like a handmade electronics handbook. So they were really kind of making up this working method as they went along. So the circuits that Louis developed for this music were extremely unique, and they were based on principles of cybernetics. So with the proliferation of AI and artificial and machine learning in our kind of current cultural climate, cybernetics has become popular again, so a lot of you might have heard of it. And cybernetics is kind of generally the study of systems. It really looks at kind of mechanisms of feedback and control. And it's really interested in kind of not only autonomous systems, so systems that are self-operating, but also kind of analogies between biological and electrical systems. So especially in the 1950s, that was really the interest. So how do electrical systems operate similarly to kind of biological life forms? And Louis was extremely influenced by this idea and extremely influenced by the work of Norbert Wiener, who in 1948 wrote a book called Cybernetics that ended up being a bestseller in the US. And for a book that is basically a math book with kind of a fringe philosophy and theory of, again, kind of how autonomous systems work, it's kind of notable that that ended up being a bestseller and actually really kind of had a big cultural influence in the 1950s. Another thing to note is that these were vacuum tube circuits, so you can see they have these giant kind of tubes, and those are these big capacitors that kind of help amplify the signal as it went through. A couple other notable things about these circuits is, again, because they were developed by principles of cybernetics, Louis Baron actually used equations from Norbert Wiener's book to model the circuits. So he basically made the circuits based on equations from the book. And these were nonlinear or chaotic circuits. So the sounds aren't nice oscillator linear sounds. They're kind of noisy, and they'll change really quickly from more of like a sine tone to something much more noisy and back and forth and back and forth. He was really interested in the fact he thought of these circuits as kind of being living creatures, as having their own life form. And he says here, the circuits would exhibit characteristic qualities of pitch, timbre, and rhythm, and had sort of a life cycle from their beginning until they burned out. And that's exactly what he would do when they recorded them, is he would sort of explore all the different parameter space of the circuit, and then he would overload it until it literally caught on fire and wouldn't make sound anymore. So he kind of felt that he was bringing the circuit through its entire life cycle. And he also thought that these circuits kind of functioned similarly to kind of like the psychological functioning of a lower life forms, like something like an amoeba or something like that. Another thing that's interesting that Louis and B.B. Baron did is they created something called leitmotifs. And leitmotifs are a musical technique that were developed really in the late 1800s for opera, and then it became really common in films. So sort of the most common example of a leitmotif is the theme from Jaws. Da-da, da-da, da-da. So you know, every time you hear that theme, the shark is somewhere close. And it's basically equating a musical theme with a character, so that every time you hear that musical theme, you think of the character, and then sometimes you combine the themes in different ways to basically show how the characters are connected in one way or another. So basically each character in the Forbidden Planet film got a different circuit, and so each character had kind of different its own unique sound quality, so they kind of made these leitmotifs for the characters. Okay, now to talk a bit about what BB did with the tape. She was very much interested in another kind of feedback, which was tape delay. And tape delay is basically, we'll talk about it more when we talk about Pauline Oliveros in a couple weeks, where you feed a tape loop through multiple tape machines to cause kind of a reverb or delay. And it creates this kind of interesting like whirring sound. And that became really emblematic of different kind of science fiction soundtracks. So BB did a ton of stuff with the tape. She not only recorded the circuit, she then edited the tape, so cut it, splice it, reorder it, tape it back together. She found various ways to kind of make the tape and the circuits musical. She would slow things down. She would layer different tapes together. And she also played things backwards or forwards and created all these different techniques, including the tape delay technique, to basically take the circuits from a raw recording to music and soundtracks and sound effects for the film. I'll read, I'm actually not going to read this for you. You can all read this on your own, but this is a little bit, this is the music note to the recording of the soundtrack. And again, here you talk about it, you can see that they're interested in the connections between animals and machines. And then they end by saying there were no synthesizers or traditions of electronic music when we scored this film, and therefore we were free to explore terra incognito with all its surprises and adventures. So the main title to Forbidden Planet is one of your required listenings, so make sure that you listen to that. And also I highly recommend going on YouTube and looking up some clips of Forbidden Planet so that you can see a bit of it yourself. Okay, so now we're going to talk about John Cage. And I mentioned last week, or in the last lecture when I talked about Cage, that we're going to talk about him a bit in the quarter because every time a new technology was available, he tended to use it really early on and kind of adapted his techniques to that technology. So he was pretty important in kind of exploring and setting the pace for using certain new technologies. And also remember when we read The Future of Music Credo, he was really interested in kind of being able to make music directly or make music without having to rely on instrumentalists and things like that. And magnetic tape kind of proved a really important vehicle for him to be able to do that. So in 1951, Cage was really excited about the prospect of magnetic tape. It was just starting to become more available. He knew the barons because they kind of ran in similar circles, so he knew that he could get access to a tape recorder. And he convinced one of his friends, Paul Williams, who recently came into some inheritance, to donate or give him $5,000 so that he could start what was called the Project for Music for Magnetic Tape. And I tend to just call it the Music for Magnetic Tape Project. And that ran for 3 years. And basically what this did is this money basically funded several composers to be able to use the Barron studio almost full time to compose pieces. And so the composers that made pieces at the Barron studio were part of a group that Cage kind of belonged to at this time, the New York School, including a composer named Christian Wolff, Earl Brown, Cage, David Tudor, and Morton Feldman. And David Tudor actually didn't make a piece at this time, but we'll talk about him later. He became a composer later, but he did help out with the project. And with this funding, Louis and B.B. Barron also made their own piece, which was called Music for, I believe, Music for Electronic Nervous System. So it basically, this $5,000 basically paid Louis and B.B.'s salary for several years so that they could make creative work. So a little bit of the aesthetic background of Williams' mix, which I should have mentioned before, was named after Paul Williams, the man who donated that $5,000 so that Cage and his kind of collaborators could start the Project for Music for Magnetic Tape. The aesthetic kind of context of this is that in the 1950s, Cage started to incorporate elements of chance into his composition. And the reason that he did this, there's several reasons, but he wanted to, what he says, imitate nature in her manner of operation. What does that mean? Basically, if you ever hear sounds out in the world, for instance, something like rain, you know that there's kind of a regularity to what you're hearing, but you can't predict the exact second or millisecond when a sound or a drop of rain is going to happen. And Cage found this concept fascinating because he thought that it was both a way to kind of remove old composerly habits, make something entirely new, and encounter sounds in a totally surprising way. So he felt like composition at the time was very predictable. Even something like Schoenberg, which was totally atonal, he wanted to incorporate basically the novel as much as possible here. And so he developed what are called indeterminate procedures. So again, elements of chance into the music. And the primary way in which he did this is that he developed a compositional technique using the I Ching. And the I Ching is sometimes called the Book of Changes, which was an ancient divination kind of practice or technique that dates back from over 1000 BC, so 2000 years ago. Some estimates say that it's even older. And early on before kind of modern society, people would sort of shuffle around sticks in a tortoise shell and come up with these hexagrams. And these hexagrams were associated with numbers, which were associated with kind of different characteristics and sort of different, almost like astrology. So it would be like reading your horoscope on a given day. Each of these numbers corresponded with kind of different kind of stock basically statements about, you know, what you might be encountering in your daily life. And again, it was sort of like a way to kind of frame your life at a time. But Cage was really interested in this aspect, and when he made these hexagrams, he just used coins and tossed coins. But he was really interested in just tossing coins to basically come up with these hexagrams that are associated with these numbers to make compositional decisions for him. And the way that that would work, I don't want to get too into it, is he would basically make these large charts with 64 cells, and he would put different kind of music. Each chart would be a different musical parameter. So say with Williams mix, one of the parameters might be tape length. And so each of the 64 boxes would have a different length of tape. So he'd toss coins to come up with hexagrams so that at any given moment or the next piece of tape, the length of which would be decided by tossing these coins. And he did that for every musical parameter possible. So volume, the way in which he cut the tape, the attack or decay, so again, the angle of the tape. Another thing that he did was what kind of sound he was going to make. So this is how he made all the compositional decisions in Williams mix. And so that's a bit of the aesthetic background. So a bit more about Williams mix. One of the things that Cage used to make this piece was that Louis and Bibi Baron had a sound recording library of somewhere between 500 and 600 recordings. And these were just recordings that they had made around the city or purchased or collected, sound effects, libraries, things like that. So they had over, again, between 500 and 600 recordings. So what Cage did for Williams mix is he divided these 500 or 600 recordings into 6 categories: city sounds, country sounds, electronic sounds, manually produced sounds, wind-produced sounds, and what he calls small sounds, or sounds that require amplification to hear. So again, he also tossed the coins of the I Ching to decide which category of sound he was going to use. The piece is also made up of 8 different tracks, so that's basically 8 different strips of tape. And you can see here, this is a piece of the score. There are 2 systems, so each page contains, first you go through the top and then you go through the bottom. So it contains 2 musical systems. And he did make a score for this piece, which he referred to as basically a dressmaker's pattern. So someone could basically recreate the piece by just cutting the tape to these exact specifications. And you can see here there's lots of little notes and different kind of, there's a key for the different parameters that you would have to make decisions about. And again, all the decisions were made using the I Ching. And this piece was premiered at the University of Illinois in 1954, so it wasn't heard right away. It was heard a few years later after he made it. And a couple more things about the piece is that you can see here, if it was a 192-page score and you had to make all these cuts of tape and pick all the tape using the I Ching and tossing coins, that would take a really, really long time, and it did. So basically it took Cage and David Tudor and a couple of his other friends over 9 months to create, just to cut the tape and put the entire piece together. So he initially had the idea in 1951, but he didn't actually finish the piece until 1953. And something else that's interesting is that because Cage made this score and the instructions for making the piece are so clear, other people can reconstruct the piece later, and people have done that. So one of the most famous reconstructions of the piece is by a composer named Tom Erb, but also more recently, the hip-hop group Clipping made a reconstruction of the piece, and I actually included that in this lecture's extras. But please go back and listen to Cage's Williams mix. This is basically his original tape that he created, and it was played in 1958 at a retrospective concert. And so it's actually a live playback of the piece. So that means there were 8 different speakers, and so that basically the different tape channels were dispersed throughout the room, and you'll hear when you listen to it, there is a real mixed reaction. There's some booing, there's some cheering, some people loved it, some people hated it, and that's pretty indicative of Cage in general. He was a pretty polarizing figure. So again, please go back and listen to Cage's Williams mix, which is your required listening. And again, as always, if you have any questions about this lecture, please put them in this week's discussion forum, and I or your fellow students will be more than happy to answer them. Hello everyone. So in lecture 4, we talked about the development of magnetic tape machines, and we also looked at 2 early pieces in the United States that used magnetic tape technology. So today in lecture 5, we're going to kind of continue to look at early music that used magnetic tape, and we are going to start doing sort of an international survey and look at several different countries and how in each of these different countries composers and technologists started to use this new magnetic tape technology. So between today's lecture and lecture 7, we're going to go to France, Germany, Japan, South America, and England to look at the various ways that tape music was developed there. So this is not at all an exhaustive survey, but this is just kind of a sort of smattering of different approaches to music with magnetic tape. And this is part of a kind of general move after World War II, where basically magnetic tape became much, much more accessible, especially commercially. So by the mid-1950s, you could get a magnetic tape machine pretty much on any continent. And so people started to buy them and use them. And we also start to see the establishment of different kinds of studios and collectives that make electronic music using tape. And what we start to see after World War II into the mid-1950s through the 1960s is that these practices of both using magnetic tape and of electronic music really start to codify. And again, it kind of looks different in different places. So for instance, what we see in France and in Germany, very unified, coherent, almost monolithic aesthetic movements and aesthetic schools start to codify, to the point where in France, they basically only kind of made one kind of electronic music, and the same was true in Germany. And it's a little bit more complicated than that, but basically the established studios kind of supported the creation of one kind of electronic music. Whereas in the United States and in South America and in Japan, we see that it's a little bit more varied, and there aren't such unified aesthetics associated with each of these countries. So what we see in France and Germany in particular is that electronic music really starts to take on sort of nationalistic characteristics, where it becomes really identified with a composer or musician's national identity. So again, that was sort of different than in the United States or in South America or in Japan, or even in England, where we're also going to look. Some of the other large differences that we'll see in music, electronic music internationally, is sort of where it's created, the institutions that support its creation. So what we'll see is in the United States, the creation of electronic music is really supported at studios, at universities, and also at independent studios or collectives. Whereas in Europe, in particular France, Germany, but also in Italy and Switzerland, we see that studios are really established at radio stations. And these radio stations had government funding and a lot of financial support, so they had a ton of resources available to them. And we can kind of think of these national radio stations as kind of close to NPR, but they had a very different funding structure in Europe, and basically these studios at radio stations in Europe also had a lot of funding to basically create research wings. And so we'll look at several examples of that. In Japan, we see kind of like in the US, there are independent collectives that create electronic music, but then we also see that radio stations, that electronic music studios are established at radio stations as well. So again, it's kind of a mixture of the two. And the same is true in South America. So in South America, primarily studios were at universities or at independent studios. And again, each of these different places had really different funding structures. So again, what we start to see in the 1950s is really this establishment of different artistic traditions. And like I said, in some places it kind of takes on more nationalistic qualities, whereas in other places they're more disparate trends. So to get started, today we're going to talk about the development of musique concrète in France. And then in part 3 of the lecture, we're going to go to South America and look at the development of tape music in South America. So in France, the development of tape music was really, and electronic music in general, was really centered around the Radio Diffusion Française. And I have to apologize in advance that my French accent is really horrible. So the Radio Diffusion Française was the main national radio station in Paris. And there was an engineer that worked at the Radio Diffusion Française, and from here on out, I'll probably refer to it as the RDF. So there was an engineer working at the RDF in the 1940s named Pierre Schaeffer. And he was kind of a jack of all trades. He was primarily a radio engineer, but he also became a theorist. And in the 1940s, he started to experiment and develop theories about recorded sound, and also started to make some early music compositions. So I'm going to talk a little bit about his theories first. So his main theory was that of acousmatic sound, or acousmatic listening. An acousmatic sound is basically a sound that is separated from its source. So one really easy example of this is, say you're in one bedroom and your roommate is in another bedroom of your apartment, and they yell to you from the kitchen and say, "Hey, do you want scrambled eggs?" You might not see them, but you can hear them. You know who's talking, you know what you're hearing, but the sound is separated from its source. You can't see your roommate talking to you. Another example is if you're sitting in your bedroom and you hear a bird chirping outside, but you can't actually see it. So these are experiences that we can have without recorded sound. But what Pierre Schaeffer was really interested in is the fact that with recorded sound, again, starting really early on in the 1870s with the phonograph, that this recorded sound really exploited this phenomenon. So all recorded sound in general was acousmatic sound. So if you heard someone speaking or singing, that person wasn't in the room with you. But you maybe knew who the artist was. If it was Elvis Presley singing Hound Dog or something, you knew that it was Elvis Presley, but he wasn't there in the room with you. And you could experience sort of almost like an interaction with this person or this subject without actually being in the same place at the same time. And he was really, really interested in this phenomenon. And he started to make compositions in particular that exploited acousmatic sound or acousmatic listening situations. So you can imagine what these compositions were made up of were clips of pre-recorded sound. And again, this is really, he wanted to create musical situations of acousmatic listening. And out of these experiments, Pierre Schaeffer started to develop a new artistic tradition or a new aesthetic technique, which was called musique concrète. And musique concrète is basically a musical composition made up of a collage of pre-recorded sound. So very simple definition. Of course, but Pierre Schaeffer had some strict rules about this, and that'll become clearer when we look at the first example. And he considered each of these clips of pre-recorded sound as an objet sonore, or a sound object. So basically, by recording an object, for instance, a train, which is what he does in the first piece that we'll look at, you create then like an objectification, a sound objectification of that thing, a train. And so for him, musique concrète is about combining objets sonores in different ways. But for Pierre Schaeffer in general, he really wanted listeners to still be able to identify what the sound source was. So even if the tape was altered or the sound clip was altered in some way or another by looping it or by adding reverb or other alterations, he still thought that it was important that the sound could be recognized. And so we'll see later that that caused a lot of tension with other composers, but this was really part of his vision for what musique concrète was. So getting to this objectification, that kind of brings us back to someone like Marcel Duchamp with his ready-mades and this kind of objectification of objects, putting a new frame around it and putting it in a new context. And Pierre Schaeffer has this quote here that'll kind of help connect those dots. So he said, "I was suddenly aware that the only mystery worthy of interest is concealed in the familiar trappings of triviality." So again, these sounds that we encounter in the everyday. And he said, "And I noticed without surprise the noise of things one could perceive beyond sounds, the daily metaphors they suggest to us." this determination to compose with materials taken from an existing collection of experimental sounds I name musique concrète to mark well the place in which we find ourselves, no longer dependent on perceived sound abstractions, but now using fragments of sound existing concretely and considered sound objects defined and whole. So again, he's very much interested in like real sounds that exist out in the world and objectifying and sort of appropriating those real world sounds into a new context to create a musical composition. So again, that's really not dissimilar from Marcel Duchamp's approach with the ready-mades. So there's some interesting things about Pierre Schaeffer's approach to making early musique concrète. And one of the most interesting things is that the first versions of these pieces for the first 3 to 4 years that he was making these pieces, he didn't have access to a magnetic tape machine. So he made these pieces using phonograph records. So he had to actually use a disc cutting lathe to re-record sounds onto a vinyl disc. So it was really cumbersome to make these early compositions, and it's kind of hard to imagine that he could make these without the relative ease of magnetic tape later. And of course, by the early 1950s, he did get access to magnetic tape, but early on these pieces were made using discs and disc cutting lathes. So that's a pretty important early aspect of these pieces. So your required listening for this section is one of the first pieces that Pierre Schaeffer made of musique concrète, and it was part of a series of 5 pieces which he called the Étude du bruit, or noise etudes, or concert of noises. So again, he kind of thought of these sounds not as sounds, but as noises, like everyday sounds somehow took on this element of noise. So the one that we're going to listen to is, and again, I apologize for my accent, is the Étude aux chemins du feu, or the train etude. And so for this piece of musique concrète, Pierre Schaeffer both used the existing sound effects catalog at the radio station, and he also went out and made several recordings of trains around Paris, and he combined all these recordings together. He made several loops, he made cuts, he played some of the recordings backwards, he played some of them forward, he applied filters, and then he put it all together and made a composition, this train etude. And so I'll say that again, some of the techniques that he had at his disposal, he again re-recorded all of these recordings onto a disc using a disc cutting lathe, and you can see a picture of that here. And then he also used a turntable to sort of re-record those, and that was a variable speed turntable like Cage had access to at the Seattle radio station. He also used filters, reverb, and another thing that he developed really early on were he created loops in these discs by physically putting grooves into the records. So we'll hear that there are some loops there. And so that was the early equipment that he had access to for these early pieces of musique concrète in the late 1940s. So I'm going to play a little bit of this, but again, this is your required listening, so please go back and listen to this on your own. Okay, so I'm going to stop it there. So you heard a couple things there. You could hopefully maybe hear the reverb on there, and also he was clearly using loops in that section, 2 different loops. Another thing that he used is kind of the recurring motive of the train's whistle. So again, these sounds are, you can really tell that it's a train. It's not, there's not a lot of opacity or ambiguity about what we're hearing. If you especially if you've heard a train sound before, or even movies and films and stuff, you pretty much know that this is a train, and that was by design. So we're going to continue on in sort of the timeline of Pierre Schaeffer's career and the development of musique concrète and electronic music in France. So by 1951, Pierre Schaeffer had sort of codified his ideas about musique concrète and acousmatic listening, and he became kind of an authority on recorded sound within France, and especially at the Radio Diffusion Française. And so he was able to get funding to start the Groupe de Recherche Musicale, or the GRM, which is what I'll call it. And the Groupe de Recherche Musicale was basically an electronic music studio. So they got funding to have equipment and bring in composers and other people to just make musique concrète, to just make electronic music. And early on, Pierre Schaeffer brought in a composer named Pierre Henry, and that sort of lended musical credibility to what he was doing, because again, Pierre Schaeffer really wasn't a musician. He wasn't a composer. He was a radio engineer. And so even though he was attuned to sound in very particular ways, he wasn't a composer, and so it was important to him to lend the project that sort of musical credibility. And the two of them, Pierre Schaeffer and Pierre Henry, worked together a lot, especially in the 1950s, to create pieces. And one of the first pieces that they made together was called Symphonie pour un homme seul, or Symphony for a Man Alone. And if you've ever seen a French film from the 1950s or 60s, I just don't think there's a more French title than Symphony for a Man Alone. You can just imagine a French film with a guy in a striped shirt smoking a cigarette and the narrator over it like, oh, here sits a man alone. So that's an easy way that I always remember this piece, because there's something very French about this. So this symphony is pretty simple. It's 12 movements, or 12 short sections, and they used 2 kinds of sounds. They used human sounds and non-human sounds. So that's kind of how they basically categorize the pieces. And there's not anything particularly interesting about this piece, with the exception that they performed it live using turntables and various records. So it's kind of an interesting early precursor in some ways to turntablism and hip hop that we'll see in the 70s, although there is virtually no direct lineage between hip hop and musique concrète. But it's just kind of an interesting phenomenon that there's something about these technologies that sort of lend themselves to certain techniques. So again, the Groupe de Recherche Musicale really established this electronic music studio at the Radio Diffusion Française, and they early on got access to a lot of equipment, and it really became kind of the center of electronic music in France and one of the centers of electronic music in Europe in general. And they really, again, early on got access to tape recorders, tape looping machines, playback controllers, and then of course it just continued to grow and grow and grow. So something that's important, again, about musique concrète is that it basically defined electronic music in France for decades. Really, it even still, in some ways, is very connected to electronic music in France. There are still composers coming out of French schools that sort of say that they make musique concrète. So it's a very dominant style in France. And partly because of what I consider kind of gatekeeping. Pierre Schaeffer had really strict rules about what he considered musique concrète and what he didn't consider musique concrète. And because he was in charge of this studio for so long, he basically said who was able to get access to this equipment and who wasn't. And so something that we'll see both at the Radio Diffusion Française and really most of these studios that are developed in the 1960s or 50s through the 70s, so in some cases the 60s, is that there's a lot of gatekeeping going on. Really, primarily only men are making electronic music. Women typically weren't allowed in the studio or considered they weren't included, or their work wasn't considered relevant enough or didn't adhere to the aesthetics that they wanted to in ways. So they basically found ways to exclude people of color and also women. And we'll see this pretty consistently in the different studios as we look, do our international survey of tape music. And there are some exceptions, but it is something that we see. Okay, so that is the end of part 1 of lecture 5. And in part 2, we're going to look at 2 more pieces of musique concrète that were made at the GRM. And then we're going to look at tape music in South America. So the first piece that we're going to look at is a piece by Edgard Varèse. You might remember Edgard Varèse from a few of our other lectures. He's the composer that came up with that sort of revolutionary new definition of music as organized sound. We also listened to his piece Ionization in lecture 2. So one thing that I mentioned about Varèse is that throughout his career, he was always really interested in the potential for electronic music. But for one reason or another, he was never really able to get access to equipment in the way that other composers were. But by the early 1950s, once the GRM was established in Paris and once tape machines really became a lot more accessible, he was finally able to get access. And again, I also mentioned that Varèse was French, but he lived in the United States for decades, and then by the 1950s, he was back in France. And he worked for several years at the GRM with Schaeffer to use the tools that they had there, and he made a couple pieces of musique concrète really at the end of his career. So the first piece that he made is a piece called Deserts, which he made really in pretty close collaboration with Schaeffer. I think you could think of Schaeffer really as the kind of technologist who was helping Varèse. Varèse was like an older man at this point, so he was really helping Varèse use the tape machines and use the other tools that they had available, even though Varèse was really kind of responsible for the compositional ideas. And that's not an uncommon sort of dynamic that we see in these studios at this time, is that often composers didn't actually know how to use the technology, and they really required the collaboration of a technician to actually use the tools. And so that's something we'll talk more about when we talk about the studio in Germany. But that was really common, and something that's really unfortunate is that there was really a hierarchy of labor, and technicians often didn't get credit for their work. But again, that's something we'll talk about a little bit more next week. So the piece that we're going to talk about is a piece called Poème électronique, and in some ways this piece kind of represents the sort of height of musique concrète. So even though musique concrète continued to be developed in France for decades after this piece, it in some ways this piece really exemplifies musique concrète. So a little background about the piece. It was composed for the World's Fair in Brussels, and a special pavilion was constructed just for the presentation of this piece. And so we can see images of this here. It was really a remarkable structure, and it was a temporary structure, so it doesn't exist anymore. And it was designed by a famous architect named Le Corbusier, in collaboration with a composer and architect named Ioannis Xenakis, who we're going to talk about next. And so this was really a unique building, and it was unique in several ways, partly because of the shape and how sound would travel inside of it, and also because throughout this structure there were 400 loudspeakers. So there were speakers all over the structure, and Poème électronique was kind of conceptualized as almost a multimedia piece. So there was not only sound, there were also projections and lights, and so it would have been really a multimodal experience if you were to hear this at the time. And another thing that I'll talk about in a minute is that this piece was really especially designed for the pavilion and vice versa. So Varèse considered the piece, he called it a montage of found sounds. So again, really a collage of pre-recorded sounds. And the timbres that you hear are going to be really similar to his acoustic music. So there's a lot of percussion, bells, voices, sirens, but we also hear electronic tones and also recordings of factories, things that wouldn't have been possible in his early acoustic works. And something to kind of note about this piece that really distinguishes it from, say, something like Cage's Williams mix is that the sounds aren't super layered. They really kind of proceed one after the other. And Schaeffer's technique was sort of similar, as we heard in the Train Etude. It's kind of like you hear one loop and then you hear the next. There's not a lot going on at one time. You kind of go from one sound to the next. So the tape itself had 4 different channels, which meant that there were 4 reels of tape. And something that's really interesting that Varèse did with these 4 different channels of tape is that each channel had a unique route through the speakers in the pavilion. So the sounds were moving in space. So that did several things. The sounds that you would hear would change depending on where you were standing in the pavilion, and they were also moving around all the time. And what we see with tape is that space really becomes an element, a parameter of composition that composers could use in ways that really had not been possible before. And so we'll see with a lot of these pieces, early pieces, that space really becomes important. So where sounds are happening in space becomes a new element that composers can be creative with. And again, the last thing to note is that this piece was really designed to be multimedia, so it would have been really a whole experience. Visual, sonic, there were lights, it would have been a really unique experience. And before I play it, I'm just going to read this quote that Varèse said about his piece. He said, "The work progresses in opposing planes and volumes, a simultaneous interplay of unrelated elements that interweave at calculated but not regular time lapses. This corresponds to the definition of rhythm in physics and philosophy as a succession of alternate and opposing correlative states." Okay, so we're going to listen. I'll just play maybe a minute of this, but it is one of your required listening pieces, so make sure that you go back and listen to the whole thing on your own. Okay, so I'm going to stop right there, and I just want to highlight a couple of different things. So I'm not sure if you heard it this way on your computer at home, but if you go back and listen to this YouTube video, and I believe the MP3 that I have uploaded on Canvas, and you listen to it with headphones, the sounds that are going into each of your headphones are actually different. So you can get some sense of the spatialization by listening to it using headphones. And the other thing I want you to notice is that he definitely, this is more compositional than Pierre Schaeffer's Train Etude. He's really thinking musically about these sounds. And so he opened with those bells and then ended this section here with those electronic tones, the da-na-na, and that repeats throughout the work, as do the bells and as do some of the other sounds. So he's really thinking kind of thematically and musically and compositionally in a way that Pierre Schaeffer was not. And again, that's one of the reasons why this is kind of considered sort of like the height of musique concrète. So one thing that I want you to think about on your own and maybe be able to kind of articulate at least to yourself is how do these two works, Edgard Varèse's Poème électronique and Pierre Schaeffer's Train Etude, compare to Williams' mix, where in Williams' mix, all of the pre-recorded sounds were just arranged literally by chance. And whereas here, everything was chosen very precisely and carefully for very particular reasons. And some of you might say, yeah, I almost experienced virtually no difference. But I want you to listen to these pieces and be able to distinguish between them and kind of find ways for yourself to understand, okay, so Cage was using chance and that has these implications for what I'm hearing, versus Varèse and Schaeffer were really carefully composing their pieces and intentionally deciding when each sound was going to happen, and maybe how those distinctions play out. Because again, on some levels, these pieces are very similar. They're all using clips of pre-recorded sound. However, the effects are in some ways quite different. Okay, so now we're going to listen to another piece, and the reason why I want to talk about this piece is really to illustrate Pierre Schaeffer's very strict idea of what could be considered musique concrète, and very strict idea of what kind of music he thought should be electronic music or could be electronic music, and the kind of music that was supported at the GRM. And the reason is that this piece, Ioannis Xenakis was, as I mentioned before, an architect and a mathematician and a composer. And from 1957, I believe, to 1962, he worked at the GRM with Pierre Schaeffer, and he learned the techniques of musique concrète and started making electronic music compositions. And his composition of this piece, Bohor, in 1962, basically caused a rift between Xenakis and Schaeffer. And basically, Xenakis kind of got kicked out of the GRM. He wasn't really allowed to come back and do his work there. So when you hear it, you might say, "This I don't understand. Like, he's just making his composition. Why was this so dramatic?" But this is something that Pierre Schaeffer did a lot, and it's kind of indicative of his gatekeeping, that if someone's music didn't adhere to his very strict ideas of musique concrète, they were basically ostracized and not given access to the resources at the GRM. So again, a little bit more about Xenakis. He helped design the Philips Pavilion with Le Corbusier, and he even was able to compose a piece for it called Concert PH. And this piece, Bohor, is also in some ways kind of a piece of musique concrète, but it really takes it to an extreme. And this piece was titled after Bohor the Outcast, who is the subject of a medieval song cycle. And a medieval song cycle, you can basically think of it as like a medieval concept album, where each of the different songs in kind of like a collection of songs were all on a similar theme. And Bohor was one of the knights of King Arthur's Round Table. So I think Xenakis kind of identified with this figure and was interested in kind of exploring this figure sonically. So a couple things about this piece. It used 8 channels. So again, 8 different reels of tape, basically. And what you can see here in this bottom diagram is that he had a very unique spatial organization pattern. So he really had a clear idea of where in space each of these different channels should go. He also used 4 different sound sources, and in his mind, he wanted to bring together elements of Eastern and Western music. And so now that we can see that this is a kind of clear example of cultural appropriation, that's not necessarily okay, and that's something that I'd love to talk more about in our discussion forum if for those of you that are interested. So the 4 sound sources that Xenakis uses for this piece include a cane, which is a Laotian mouth organ, and it's free reed, which means there's a little reed that's floating inside of there that provides this really kind of buzzy sound. So I'll play just a quick clip of this. So that has, again, a really unique kind of buzzy sound. And there are similar instruments to this found kind of throughout the Asian continent. He also used what he called Oriental jewelry, but was actually likely Iraqi jewelry that had these little kind of metal balls on it, or even potentially Hindi jewelry. He also used recordings of Byzantine chant, which were part of the Greek Orthodox tradition. He went to boarding school in Greece and was kind of raised in this Orthodox Byzantine tradition. So I'll play a little bit of this. So something that's kind of interesting about that chant tradition is that it kind of sits between more Middle Eastern traditions of music and traditions that we see in Europe. So it doesn't use the same scales and modes that we see in in Western kind of European church music, but it's also not quite exactly like maqam or the kinds of scales and modes that we would see in Middle Eastern music either. It kind of sits between the two. So again, I think that's kind of where Xenakis got this idea of the East and the West, but again, it's kind of indicative of a sort of cultural attitude, Western attitude at the time, where basically they thought of kind of all musical material as being sort of available for their use. And then the last kind of sound source that Xenakis used was the prepared piano. So I didn't talk about this when I talked about John Cage, but one of the early developments that Cage created in the 1940s was something called the prepared piano. And the prepared piano is where you open up a piano, and on the strings on the inside, you place screws or erasers or things in between the strings, so that when you play the keys, it changes the sound quality. And you'll hear it in the recording. They sometimes sound almost like percussion instruments. So here's a piece, one of John Cage's sonatas and interludes for the prepared piano. Okay, so again, Xenakis used recordings of all of these sound sources in Bohor, and you can see here with his spatialization scheme that each of these sources was kind of pumped out to a different space in the room where it was performed. Another thing about Xenakis and this piece is that he was really obsessed with bells, and this became really important to the sort of development of his compositional philosophy, which he was developing at this time. And the thing that he was really fascinated about with bells is that they had both stable and unstable elements. So it's kind of, when you ring a bell, you hear kind of a fundamental frequency that's almost like a drone, but then there are also a lot of noisy and kind of unstable sliding tones that you can hear. So again, kind of stable and unstable elements. And so with his pieces, Xenakis started to explore the idea of what he called sound clouds or sound galaxies, where there are more static elements, but then it's sort of like a slowly evolving structure that has a lot of internal details that are constantly in flux. So kind of like a bell. And I'll say that again. It's this idea of like a slowly evolving structure or sound mass where the internal details are constantly in flux. And so we'll hear a little bit of that in Bohort. And so I'm just going to play a little bit for you. And I'm going to skip ahead a bit. Not too far. And something that you'll notice is that it gets really noisier and noisier throughout. Well, I'll let you listen to the rest of that on your own, but something to notice is that it really does get noisier and noisier throughout, and it becomes less and less easy to identify the different sound sources. And I believe because of that, this caused this rift between Xenakis and Schaeffer which is sort of ridiculous. I mean, he's still using these pre-recorded sounds, but kind of pushing them to the extremes and really exploring what he could do with them and incorporating them into this new compositional philosophy. So it really just shows how strict Pierre Schaeffer's ideas about musique concrète were. Okay, so that's it for part 2 of the lecture. Up next, we'll talk about tape music in South America. All right, so now we're going to talk about tape music in South America. So tape music in South America really starts to emerge in the early 1950s once magnetic tape machines basically became commercially available. And what we see in South America is that the studios and composers really only had access to kind of commercial grade technology. So they didn't necessarily get some of the special connections to industry or to academia that happened in Europe or the United States. And one other thing that I want to say before we get too into talking about the music here is that for a really long time there was a real bias towards music in the United States and in Europe, Western Europe in particular, especially in music histories or concerts and what kind of music was programmed. So for a really long time, tape music in South America was really kind of left out of the narratives about electronic music. And so really it's only been in the last decade that scholars have started to look into the music that was made there and the traditions that were started there and the techniques that were developed in South America. And so we're really benefiting from that now, but there also still isn't quite as much information as there is about the electronic music in the United States and in Europe. So that's just to preface this. But there is a great article by Eduardo Herrera on your recommended reading list. So if you want to learn more about electronic music in Argentina in particular, I recommend that you read it. Okay, so again, what we start to see is that by the early 1950s and the mid-1950s especially, now that magnetic tape machines became more available commercially, we start to see composers incorporate magnetic tape into their musical practices. And again, to mention where electronic music was made in South America, it was kind of all over the place. And in general, it tended to be primarily in independent studios, but also occasionally at universities and also occasionally at radio stations. So again, radio stations were a great place where composers could kind of use the materials available on their own time. However, there weren't actual studios or research centers established at radio stations like we saw at the Radio Diffusion Française with the Groupe de Recherche Musicale. So the two centers of electronic music in South America are really in Argentina and Chile. We also see electronic music develop in Brazil, in Mexico, in Uruguay, in Peru, really all over the place. But it was really in Argentina and Chile that kind of started to stand out as centers. And Brazil is kind of a 2.5 in there. It also kind of plays into that mix. So what we see is that composers that were, or musicians that were interested in using technology basically came from all over South America to study at these centers. So these were really multinational centers, even though they were maybe housed in one country or another. And we really see that in particular here in Argentina with the Electronic Music Studio at the Centro Latino America de Altos Estudios Musicales. And CLEAM, as I'll call it, was sort of a general music studio, music institution, but they got funding to start a laboratory of electronic music, or an electronic music studio. And for decades, this electronic music studio not only trained composers from all over South America. So we see, or the Americas in general, so Argentina, Bolivia, Brazil, Colombia, Puerto Rico, Uruguay, the United States. They also brought in international composers. So composers from Europe, composers from the United States, composers from Japan. They brought composers in from all over the place. So it was a real center of activity, basically for kind of new music and avant-garde music. And even though it supported the creation of many styles of music, so it supported the creation of more experimental styles of music, the people at this studio still tended to look towards Europe in particular, and to some degree the United States, as kind of the aesthetic models to sort of model their work after. Or to model their studio after. So for instance, the Electronic Music Studio at CLEAM was modeled after the Electronic Music Studio at the Columbia Princeton Electronic Music Center, which we'll talk about in the next lecture. So that's just something to be aware of. And because it was sort of this established institution, I think it was in some ways more strict than the Taller Experimental de Sonido, which we'll talk about in a minute. But however, I think within those bounds, they did support the creation of many different kinds of music. So more experimental styles as well. But in general, the music out of CLEAM tended towards kind of serial music or avant-garde music that you might have also heard in Europe at the time. And some composers that are really associated with the CLEAM studio early on include Cesar Bolaños, who is from Peru, but then spent a lot of time in Argentina at the studio. And he's, I think, a good exception to this rule, where he really developed a lot of his own kind of compositional procedures and ideas that were pretty distinct from what was happening in Europe. Whereas Mauricio Kegel ended up emigrating to Germany, and his style of composing tends to be very closely associated with the electronic music that came out of Germany, and same with Mario Davidovsky, who immigrated to the United States and actually worked at the Columbia Princeton Electronic Music Studio. His style of composing tended towards more of the kind of music that was happening in Europe at the time as well. So that's a bit about CLEAM in Argentina. Let's see if I have anything else to say about that. Oh, again, one thing that I want to mention, and this was true of CLEAM and it was also true of the other studio that we'll talk about, is that it was really kind of a makeshift studio that depended on consumer electronics. They didn't have a lot of specialized equipment or laboratory or science equipment like we'll see in other places. They really had consumer grade electronics that they were able to use. And they did a lot with this technology. And they, as you can see here in a picture of the studio, they had access to a good number of things, but they didn't have, they basically had access to consumer grade electronics. So now we're going to talk about Chile and a composer named Juan Amenabar. So Juan Amenabar is a Chilean composer who grew up and went to the University of Chile and studied electrical engineering. And around that same time, he also started working at the Radio Chilena and was a radio engineer. So we see, again, this kind of connection between electronic music and radio engineers and radio stations. But he was also a composer. And he was really interested in a composing style called algorithmic music. And most of you are probably familiar with what an algorithm is. And so what algorithmic music is a composer basically comes up with an algorithm to basically compose the piece. So they make compositional decisions by kind of putting musical material through this algorithm, and the algorithm kind of produces the musical material for them. And Juan Amenabar was really influential in Chile in particular, but it was really common for composers in South America to travel to different South American countries, which he also did. But something that he did was start the Taller Experimental de Sonido, or the Experimental Sound Studio. And this was basically a pretty ramshackle collective of people and technologies. He was able to have tape machines and filters and some other technologies, but it was kind of a loose collective of other composers from Chile and a few other South American countries that came together and made electronic music in this experimental sound studio. And kind of like I mentioned, because he established this studio, and because it wasn't affiliated with a university or really like an institute like Kleem, they were able to have a lot of aesthetic freedom, and he wasn't necessarily beheld to kind of more conservative musical ideas. So your required listening for Juan Amenabar is the first piece of tape music that he composed, and it's called Los Peces, or The Fishes. And something that's really interesting about this piece is that he wanted to create a piece of tape music that used only a single sound source. And the single sound source that he used to compose this piece was a piano. And so to make this piece, he made a bunch of recordings of the piano, and then he took them back into the studio with his tape machine and made a lot of edits and cuts and splices to compose the piece. And what he did in particular that creates a really unique timbre is he cut off the attack and decay of a sound. So for those of you that are familiar with sort of more acoustic terms, there's something called a sound envelope. You can look this up if you're not familiar with it, where basically each sound has an attack, ADSR, attack, delay, sustain, and release. And so Juan Amenabar cut off the attacks of each of these clips of the piano, and also the release, I believe. So it's just this kind of it creates this kind of continuous sound, kind of almost cloud or sound region that you can hear, and it creates a really unique effect. The other thing that he did, and again this sort of gets at the more algorithmic approach, is he created this scheme of spatialization and rhythm duration using the Fibonacci series. And we can see here he created this diagram for it. And diagrams like this are common in electronic music studios. You see composers, because the equipment, maybe they share equipment with someone else, so when it was their turn to use the tape machine, or if they only had so much tape, they really needed to have an idea of what they were going to do before they did it. It's not like with computers today where if you make a mistake in your DAW, you can just delete it and start over again. So he created this diagram for the rhythmic and spatialization scheme using the Fibonacci series. So let's take a listen to this piece. So I'm going to stop it there, but that gives you a bit of a sense of what this sounds like. And I love this piece. I think what Juan Amenabar did with these piano sounds is so beautiful, and it almost sounds like it's hard to believe that this was just a simple recording of a piano, and that just through some tape manipulation and cutting the sound at certain places that he could make this kind of sound. It almost sounds like it's made by a synthesizer or something, but the effect is really, really cool. All right, so that's it for lecture 5. Next lecture, we're going to go to Germany and Japan and England.